everything about this day, the universe was telling me not to go on this trip. Everything was telling me, you should not get in the car and drive. And it ended with me being kind of in the wrong place at the wrong time, getting out of my car to call these people to tell them I was really lost. I was just going to get a hotel because I was going to stay with one of the quintet members and I was super lost. At bad part of town, it got mugged from behind and hit with probably brass knuckles. Yeah, my jaw was broken in 3 places. I didn't have a very well-rounded self-concept that wasn't so laser focused. Now I'm a little bit more balanced. And I think, when you have that very narrow, I want to play trumpet in the Chicago Symphony or whatever your goal is. If it's that narrow, it's very hard to be happy if that doesn't happen, right? And you can't control that because it's an outcome that you can't control. You can only control how you are and who you are, right? And how you show up for the world. I'm working on a book now where I'm just kind of taking all this experience of my life, as well as working with kids, saying, how do you learn something from scratch? It doesn't start with an F on a page. It starts with how do you breathe, and then how do you form an embouchure, and then how do you make a buzz, and then how do you make a sound on the mouthpiece? So kind of going back to that square one and trying to contribute to the world of pedagogy in that way, because I feel like there's a lot written about excerpts, and there's certainly enough professionals in the world that can teach people that are really far along, but there's really not a lot of great pedagogy for beginning brass. What is your mission, right? And so now I've developed a mission that is, that I create a world of harmony and artistic transformation by empowering and educating musicians and artists and sharing music. And that's something that I can do, right? If my mission is to play in the San Francisco Symphony, that's an outcome I can't control. And so if that doesn't happen, I'm just going to be your mission really has to be about who you are and how you're showing up.
All right, welcome back to the show, everybody. Today we've got a very special guest with us. He comes from Las Vegas, Nevada. He's a horn player. And I got connected to this guy in actually doing some preliminary promoting for my show. He runs a Facebook group and a podcast called Empowering Musicians, which we'll get into a little bit later, but I've had a lot of fun getting to know him and listening to his show. It's definitely something I'll be putting in the show notes here later on. He works as a freelancer horn player, but also in the Nevada state. Forgive me, I forgot what it was called. What's it called?
So I work for the Nevada State AFL-CIO currently.
And what does that acronym stand for?
So the American Federation of Labor, the Congress of International or Industrial Organizations. I always get that mixed up.
Cool.
So the AFL-CIO is basically kind of the union of unions. So we have a state AFL here in Nevada. And before that, I worked for the American Federation of Musicians for many years. So I've always been having one foot in labor, having one foot in music. So it's a natural transition for me to be working there.
Cool. Well, without further ado, then, Michael Manley, welcome to the show. Thank you for being here.
Oh, thanks for having me, Clark. I'm really glad to share some time with you today.
Yeah, it's going to be really helpful. I mean, I think just the more I do these interviews, the more I just realize that this community is just so much bigger of musicians who have gone through injury. The statistics that I see through doing my own research, the number just seems to keep getting bigger. And so I love doing these interviews because I feel like it's, we're doing our part in helping people to get through them, right?
Yeah.
And so, without further gab, I guess, do you want to share with our audience what kind of your story with injury was? I know on your show you talk about it a little bit, and I'll definitely be putting that episode in the show notes so people can hear it there as well. But what's your story with injury?
Sure, absolutely. So I, my whole career has really been about reinvention and adaptation, right? And so I'll start even before my injury. I had a lot of natural ability on the French horn in high school. And I went through 4 years of undergraduate college at Florida State, had a really great time there, but I had some fundamental issues that were not being addressed. And so I got to grad school and studied with a wonderful teacher named Bill Purvis, who teaches at Yale. Maybe he teaches at Juilliard as well now, and was at Stony Brook at the time. I don't know if he's still there. But he basically said, you're going to have to redo your whole embouchure, refigure out how to play the French horn.
That's something every brass player wants to hear.
Yeah, exactly. So this is so ironic because that's what I spent my first year of grad school on. And so I was kind of like relearning everything. And he was a great teacher because he gave me such support and permission to do that. Because as you know, at that stage in your career, you're like, what do you mean I have to go back to square one? Like, I can't do that. I'm working on a graduate degree in performance. Like, are you crazy? So he was just a really supportive and wonderful mentor for me in that. As soon as I started my second year of grad school, I was taking an audition. It was in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. It was for a chamber group. And I'm not necessarily a very like superstitious person. I'm not terribly religious, but everything about this day, the universe was telling me not to go on this trip. Everything was telling me, you should not get in the car and drive. And so I even had a partner at the time, and I asked him, I was like, could you go with me? I'm not really feeling this trip. And he couldn't do it. He had other gigs. So I ended up going on this drive. Everything went wrong that day. I got lost. I got onto a road too early and drove 200 miles out of my way. Everything about this day was wrong. And it ended with me being kind of in the wrong place at the wrong time, getting out of my car to call these people to tell them I was really lost. I was just going to get a hotel because I was going to stay with one of the quintet members, and I was super lost. At bad part of town, it got mugged from behind and hit with probably brass knuckles. Yeah, my jaw was broken in 3 places.
Jeez.
And so somehow I got back in my car. I drove myself to the hospital, and they had to wire my jaw shut. And so that process happened. My jaw was wired shut for like about 6 weeks. And during this time, I was kind of recovering in my parents' house in Maryland. And I remember coming out of the bathroom, and my mom was like, what are you doing? You've got like toothpaste all over your face. And I was like, what are you talking about? And that's when I realized that I had permanent nerve damage on this quadrant of my chin. And so everything's still wired shut. I had to drink dinner. That was terrible. That got really old. And so when the wires came off, some of my teeth were still rotated, but at least everything was back to sort of normal. And the first day I played, I could play about a G, maybe to a C, about a fifth. And that was about it that I could get out on the horn. And, I was crushed and I was just completely devastated because this was my only like self-concept was being a French horn player. And I was like, I had never thought about doing anything else. And I had to face this idea of like, what if I can't do this the rest of my life? And so my first thought was, well, I have nerve damage, so I'm never going to play again. But actually the second day it got a little better and I kept at it. And it was really just the muscles had not been moving because my jaw had been wired shut. And so the muscles had atrophied slightly. So it was just a matter of getting back in shape. And then, so I did that, and somehow finished my degree on time, and got my playing back together, and then started doing some, auditions and gigs. I was fortunate in that I won an audition with the New Haven Symphony, at an early age, and then also with the New York City Opera National Company, which was the touring arm of the New York City Opera, back when there was a New York City Opera and back when they had a touring company. Really fun job. It was about 3 or 4 months of work every year, so it wasn't full-time work, but it was a tour where we would do a standard work of opera around the country. So fast forward, everything seems to be like a little bit on track. And then I end up this is such a weird story. So I end up updating my membership with Local 802, which was the Musicians Union of New York City. And I met a gentleman in the membership office who happened to be a church organist and also a dentist. I don't remember why he was there. And so he was, I think, trying to organize organists and had somehow ended up working for 802 part-time. Anyway, he asked me if I could do this Easter gig. I did an Easter gig for him. And I mentioned to him that I kind of really needed a teeth cleaning. He's like, well, you did a great job for me. Come on in. We'll take a look. So it was I call him Dr. Larry. Dr. Larry looks at my mouth and says, what's going on here, right? And this is about 4 years after my injury, right? 4 or 5 years.
Gotcha.
And he says, your jaw is like 16 degrees off. And I explain, well, I've got, and plus you have wire in your jaw. Like, so I explained the whole story because there is still a piece of wire in my jaw. And he basically said, well, your teeth were rotated, your jaw's now off, and you're going to look at having to get a serious TMJ issue, right? Temporal mandibular joint, if you don't address this.
Yeah, was your lower jaw like jutting forward 16 degrees? Was it giving you like a big overbite, or was it like completely like one or?
It was just kind of sideways this way, right? When I kind of closed my mouth. Yeah. So I said, okay, Larry, well, how does one treat that, right? And he said, orthodontics. I'm like, perfect. That is so awesome. Yeah. So at the time I was doing a tour, I was bouncing back and forth between Miss Saigon and Les Miserables on tour. And so Miss Saigon was like a lot of notes, but it wasn't like the hardest show in the world. It was just an endurance test. Mm-hmm. And I thought to myself, well, this is not ideal, but if I can get braces on and relearn how to play for the third or fourth time now, because, my whole embouchure changed before the injury, then I had to relearn how to play after the injury. And now I was dealing with orthodontics, and I was like, I just have to learn how to play with braces on well enough to play one piece of music, which is the second horn book to Miss Saigon. Mm-hmm. So I had about a 5-week break where the show was in a city where they had to hire a local orchestra. So we had about 5 weeks off. And I just got braces put on my face, and I was like, okay, I've got to figure this out. I've got a month to do it. And I had met a sax player who had some crooked teeth and turned me on to a product which I don't think is made anymore. It was called Ezo, and it was kind of like a denture pad, but it was like waxed gauze. And so I figured out that after much trial and error with other things, if I cut this little piece of waxed gauze into little rectangles, ran them under hot water, folded them over halfway, and then kind of like put them on my top teeth and just my bottom teeth, but only the top 2 teeth and the bottom like 4 teeth, that I could kind of play. So I was able to do that and finished out the run of Miss Saigon and was like, okay, now I'm ready to sort of get these braces off and like, what's next? And of course, what's next is you have to deal with retainers, right? So then I was playing with retainers in for a number of years after that. And then I actually ended up getting another gig later in my life with a show called The Lion King, which was doing a Las Vegas production. I was in New York at the time and thought, I was working for the League of American Orchestras and doing some really interesting artistic projects with them as a director of their artistic programs, but was really missing playing. And so when I heard about this show going into Las Vegas, I was like, that's what I want to do. I want to play Lion King in Las Vegas. And luckily there was another show that used 3 French horns out here. And I thought, well, maybe they're going to have a horn shortage and I can like get myself hired onto this job. And I did have to come out and play a little audition with the first horn player and the contractor, but I got hired to do that. And so I was actually playing that show with my retainers in, because every time I tried to take these things out of my mouth and play, it was like sliding on ice. I just couldn't figure it out and couldn't deal with it. So one day my worst nightmare happened, and thankfully my section was really supportive and great. But I got to the Lion King show, and it was about to start in 10 minutes. And I said to the principal horn player named Sandra, I said, Sandra, I have really bad news. I said, my retainers are in solution on my bathroom counter.
Oh, no.
And the show starts in 10 minutes. So I have no idea what's going to happen. Like, I don't know what's going to happen. So it was, I was really having trouble with some of the higher notes. But what was illuminating to me was my sound was like much bigger and better because there was not all this real estate being taken up by the inside of these plastic retainers.
Yeah.
And so I was like, wow, that was really a lot better, even though it's going to take me a while. So that's when I decided, like, I'm just not going to play with anything in my mouth anymore. And so that's where I am now. I'm back to playing kind of like with my normal face, but even that took a long time to kind of relearn. And I feel like all these experiences have really made me have to re-examine how we learn an instrument. Mm-hmm. And when I was doing Lion King, back around 2010, I also became a paraprofessional in the school district, and I started working with middle school kids one day a week who were just starting out on brass instruments. And that's where I learned that the pedagogy is terrible for learning how to play something. And so I'm working on a book now where I'm just kind of taking all this experience of my life, as well as working with kids, saying, how do you learn something from scratch? Like, it doesn't start with an F on a page. It starts with how do you breathe? And then how do you form an embouchure? And then how do you make a buzz? And then how do you make a sound on the mouthpiece? So kind of going back to that square one, and trying to contribute to the world of pedagogy in that way, because I feel like there's a lot written about excerpts, and there's certainly enough professionals in the world that can teach people that are really far along, but there's really not a lot of great pedagogy for beginning brass. So that's my latest pet project that I'm working on.
Oh, you're speaking my language, brother. That's awesome. In fact, it's the beginning pedagogy. 'Cause, when I got injured, that's what you have to go back to square one, right? And it was learning all the things correctly is what kept me in the game. It's like, this is the potential I now have, having this knowledge, right? And then also being able, we're both teachers, or at least I'm a prospective teacher. The prospect of being able to help others avoid the pitfalls that, that we have gone through is such a beautiful and invigorating concept to internalize, right? I don't know if there's anything else you want to add to that, but
I mean, one of the things that was really fascinating to me about all this through my whole career, and I would have maybe had a very different career if I hadn't had these huge left turns that were thrown at me. But one of the things that I've learned is that so much of what I've come to believe is unlearning and not doing versus doing. And a lot of my early teachers were very focused on facial musculature and tension in the embouchure. And I basically learned that air is what is the key to everything.
Yeah.
And that all of that focus that I was putting on my face was kind of not the path that I need to be on. So a lot of my again, it's all about hierarchy as well. What do you need to do first? First you have to breathe, and then you have to buzz. Because if you try to make the sound without the right air, then you're just working against yourself.
Right.
And then for me, I found that working with both beginning trumpet and beginning horn players, it's a lot of slurring on the harmonics. Because if you can get from note to note with the air, you can play anything. So I focus a lot of that on my teaching with beginners, a lot on just harmonic slurs. And again, a lot of the beginning pedagogy in the school systems is about trying to get people to play a lot of things together. So there's a lot of articulated notes and a lot of short notes. And when I first worked with some middle school kids, I was like, why don't these kids know how to slur and how to support the sound with the air? And it's well, the book isn't teaching them that.
Right.
So that's kind of just a little bit of a window into what I'm working on as far as pedagogy.
Yeah. It's actually interesting. My last guest that I had, the interview hasn't come out yet, but she's done, because of her injury, she's doing a lot more in the beginning research, or she's doing research into the beginning pedagogy and injury prevention in, for her case, viola. But it's
oh, wow.
The principles are the same no matter what instrument, right? Of injury prevention and just, the pedagogy principles may be different, but I guess the overarching principles are the same, right? There's just so much there. I have one of my mentors that has helped me through my injury for a time. He literally got braces just to do research on how to play with them. So he had braces for, I think, 2 years. And then, obviously documented everything about how to play efficiently with braces. Just this wonderful man from Spain that's just literally took one for the team. So,
wow.
I don't know if his research is in English yet, but it probably is. But I want to kind of shift kind of backwards, if you will, kind of talking about that initial period of your injury, that time after that very unfortunate thing happened. We were talking about this off camera, but just the kind of what the things were that you did from a musical standpoint you said it was 6 weeks that your jaw was wired shut, and did you start to play right after that, or was it still some time once they took the wires out, that you were able to start playing? What was your experience of recovery?
Yeah. So when they took the wires off, I started pretty soon after that.
Okay.
And again, I think during that time, I was just kind of depressed because I couldn't make music. And again, I feel like I didn't have a very well-rounded self-concept that wasn't so laser focused. Now I'm a little bit more balanced. And I think, when you have that very narrow, I want to play trumpet in the Chicago Symphony or whatever your goal is. If it's that narrow, like it's very hard to like be happy if that doesn't happen, right? And you can't control that because it's an outcome that you can't control. You can only control how you are and who you are, right? And how you show up for the world. So I learned that I really needed to have like a different understanding of myself and a different kind of mission. And so I think that's something we don't really work on as students, which is like, what is your mission, right? And so now I've developed a mission that is, that I create a world of harmony and artistic transformation by empowering and educating musicians and artists and sharing music. And that's something that I can do, right? If my mission is to play in the San Francisco Symphony, that's an outcome I can't control. And so if that doesn't happen, I'm just going to be your mission really has to be about who you are and how you're showing up. And so, regardless of what else happens, because I still take auditions, believe it or not, because I actually still like find that if I don't have that goal without having a full-time music job, that I just am not going to put in the time and the work.
Sure.
And so at my advanced age, I'm still taking some auditions, and it's like every time it's like, you know what? Like if I was in my old mindset, I would just be depressed about like the fact that I didn't win or whatever, or I didn't play as well as I wanted. But it's like, now I'm just like, I'm grateful for this opportunity because it really motivated me to learn so much about my playing and grow so much. So it's a very different mindset when you approach it that way.
Totally. And actually that's a beautiful segue into what I really wanted to dig into with you. In one of your podcast episodes I was listening to in preparation for our chat today, you talk about, I think this may be in your first episode, I could be wrong, but you talk about trophyizing our passion or our talent or whatever, right? And I've never heard it put that way.
Yeah.
And so could you just go into, you kind of were already touching on it, but go into a little deeper of what you mean by that and how kind of your injury, helped you, I guess, move away from that,
Yeah. Well, I think, we tend to kind of like put, and they don't use this terminology anymore, but when I was a young person, they used the term gifted and talented. I think they stopped using that. But like we put young musicians up on like a pedestal or dancers or any artists really. And, there's a lot of support. Certainly, there's a lot of nonprofit support and donations for education and for lifting up young musicians and artists and performing artists of all kinds. But, we're not very honest about like, what is the career option for that, right? So, you have a lot of, folks that are going to Juilliard and they leave or Colburn or any other, really prestigious school. And they just leave with this like huge sense of expectation and entitlement. And then they get onto the real world and they're like, wait a minute, like, there's been 2 trumpet auditions all year. And, I know the other 5 people are as good as me that are auditioning or whatever it might be. So being honest about like the fact that if you want a career, you're going to have to like create your own opportunity. And then, and understanding that like you can have a really full life being an artist without necessarily having it be your full-time job. And I think we attach a lot of times this idea that, well, if I'm not making money at it, I failed or something. Whereas it's like, there are lots of stories of like, I'm thinking of the former principal oboe of the LA Phil who got really bored playing principal oboe and then became a doctor, So there are people that are like, a lot of times we get what we want with that goal that we strive for, and we realize, actually, this isn't really what I want to do with myself. So having that kind of like perspective of realizing that like, this is not necessarily like the only path for you. And so that was something that recovering from my injury, I didn't really understand that well and was very kind of like depressed for a little while because of it. And I have to say, I think what it also did was it made me really grateful for the experiences that I'm able to have with my instrument. And, I was really fortunate. I went through a really horrific accident or injury, I should say. And I know other people that developed dystonia. They're just from doing their regular job and they can't play their instrument anymore. And so I feel like I'm kind of like the cockroach after this, nuclear war. I'm somehow still here. And like, there's no reason for me to still be able to play, but somehow, so I think the other thing about that, that path of just being so goal oriented about like, well, now you're in all state orchestra and you're in the best community orchestra for young people. And then you go on to Juilliard and then, you're going to get this, you're going to walk into a job in an orchestra or whatever it is you're thinking. There is something kind of unhealthy about that trophy kind of mentality. And so I think we have to just keep it in perspective. There's a lot of musicians that I know of who I went to school with who I didn't think were going to be the stars, frankly. I thought they were really kind of like average. And some of them are doing amazing things, like much more than I'm doing now, because they either created their own path or they just put in the work. And, so you just never know. But I think you have to have, again, that mission that's about how you're serving the world through music. And it might be that, you're playing in a community orchestra that you love to do, and you're supporting your local symphony because you're really successful as something else, right, in life. So, I think that's, in terms of like my labor side, like that's something that I think is really, not really something that we confront with students in school, which is like, what are your real options in terms of like, earning potential, right? Like,
Sure.
So if you're somebody who says like, I really hate airplanes, I don't like to fly, and my goal is to live in the country in a big house. It's like, well, you probably shouldn't try to be a freelance musician, right? Because you're going to have to live in a city and you're going to have to get on a plane. You have to, so understanding like, what is it that I want out of my life as a whole, I think is really much more healthy. And then figuring out how to fit yourself as a musician, who you can be a musician in any number of ways. So a lot of times we just think, well, I didn't win that audition, so therefore we place a value judgment on ourselves, or we think, well, I didn't end up in that career path, and so therefore I'm no longer somehow an artist. But like, we're all artists, right? At the end of the day. So,
oh man, there's so much in that I want to dig into. It's just like we just put so much emphasis on that goal or that destination. And then when it happens, either when it doesn't happen or it does happen, we put so much of our value, right? And I think it just kind of goes to show that, at least, so I'm just in my last semester in school. And I always feel like we graduate collegiate musicians not realizing that there's an epidemic of the lack of being self-aware, right? And so they go out into the world not necessarily knowing, I mean, all these skills that, I want to give you a chance to talk about this, but like the skills that go into being a musician, right, that are outside of the practice room, as you say on your show. But then also how to really, truly be process oriented and not outcome oriented, right? Because when we're outcome oriented, that's when, an injury comes along and upsets completely the entire apple cart, right? Whereas if we're process oriented, those things still, I mean, it's not saying nothing can get to you, but you learn to not only become, I guess, a more, like you know how to find fulfillment in all the right places, but you are also able to, inside the practice room, like you're more self-aware of like what your body needs, what your mind needs, but also how you can use those two things to then create the outcome that you want, but that it's not your value as a person, as a musician, as an artist, is not only found in that, right? And it's just that's just the thing I've observed, especially since my injury, is that within myself, I was not self-aware at all until I had that wake-up call, right? And then, And then as I become more self-aware of the things that I need, but also the process that is involved with becoming a better musician or recovering, that it's, it just helps me just be in a better state. I don't know. I feel like I'm rambling, but you just got me chewing on so many things, you know?
Yeah. And that's so true. And I think that's one thing that I kind of realized later in life was really not healthy, was like when my injury happened, I really had nothing else going on in my life that I thought about as a passion that I could pursue. Later on in life, I got into writing, and so I do that as well. I did experiment a little bit in college, but again, I was so narrow focused. I was like, well, I can't stop and do a double major. I've got to go on and play the French horn, right? Mm-hmm. But you're right. It's not healthy to have that one track mind and that one track kind of like feeling that, well, my ego is just gonna like die if I don't have something else. Like if I can't do this one thing.
Yeah, ego.
And so keeping it in perspective, is really key. And I think one of the things you touched on that I wanted to talk about was this idea of like extra musical things. And I think one of the, and I don't think it's this way now. Again, I've been out of school for many years, but I think when I was in school, there was a tendency to be like, well, I'm just going to practice in a practice room and, play Petrushka or whatever it is for like 4 years and then win a job. And so there was a lot of students that I remember being in a music festival called the Norfolk Festival in Connecticut, and it was a chamber music festival, and that was really my passion. I formed a quintet there, and our quintet, we really loved making music. We did some really cool stuff together. And there was another quintet, and I don't mean to like be badmouth Juilliard, but they were all from Juilliard. and we would have lunch and like they would variously sit down with us and tell us how they hated their group and how none of them got along. And I'm like, well, don't you guys play chamber music at Juilliard? And they're like, no, we just like sit in a practice room all day and work on excerpts. And it's like, well, if you can't be a good colleague and if you can't collaborate, you can't have a career. Because I was never like the number one player. And my career has never been about being the best. It's always been about being the one who can serve music. And so I developed this, because I also worked with toxic colleagues like we all do, who did not share that view. And I came up with this idea of what is my purpose when I make music with other people. And I discovered that my purpose was not to play perfectly. It wasn't to be the best. It was to make everybody around me sound good.
Yeah, totally.
And if you think about it that way, you're like, okay, well, I'm here to make everybody around me sound good. And then I just remember, and I talk about this a little bit in my podcast, some of the pitfalls that I've seen people fall into, even, there was the gig that I was doing was a union gig, the Touring World gig that I mentioned, doing Broadway shows. And at the time I was doing it, the contract was not that strong in terms of job security. It's now since been fixed to make it a little better. But at the time, I remember, two people that both played the same instrument. One was principal, one was not principal. The second person was probably a better player, like no question. Complained all the time about the first player. But you know what? The company fired the second player. They didn't fire the first player, right? Because there was this chemistry problem that was really causing problems. And it's like, well, your job isn't to be the best. Your job is to support that other person. And if the conductor or whoever makes the decisions about where people are seated, like they have ears, and if they want to make a change, they'll make a change. But like your job is to really show up and play well and support everybody around you. And so I've seen people like, my favorite story had to do with a drummer actually, who ended up getting fired. And, they literally, and I was working on the union side of things at this point, right? So I'm the union rep. And they kind of were like, I think I'm in hot water. And I was like, well, what's going on? He said, well, the conductor's tempos are all wrong. I said, okay, well, this is going to be an interesting conversation.
Yeah.
And he's like, I've studied all the versions of the show from all around the world. And I know that the worldwide music supervisor, this, and this. And if the conductor would just get in the room with me for 5 minutes, I could fix the conductor. And I said, well, here's the problem. That's not your job.
Yeah. Totally.
Like, your job is to actually follow the conductor. So that was the kind of like most extreme example of this kind of like perfection myopia that I've ever seen in my life. And sadly, that person did lose their job
Perfection myopia.
in that gig. Yeah.
That's a cool concept.
So, I mean, if we get into that headspace too much where it's like, it's just about being the best or being perfect, we lose all the context and we lose perspective, and it can create problems. So again, my entry into New York freelancing was a complete accident. And it was a situation where I was actually in New Haven, Connecticut. I was on my way back from another gig. I was with a trumpet player. We both had done a something in the Berkshires the night before. He was playing the rehearsal. I was just going to sit there and listen, right? And I show up to this rehearsal. The principal horn player happened to be somebody that I met in high school because I grew up next to a man named Walter Lawson who made French horns. He even made this French horn, which is 37 years old now. And so I had met her in his shop when she was coming through when I was in high school. And I just wanted to say hello. So I went up to her backstage. I said, I don't know if you remember me, but I met you when I was in high school and, at Walter Lawson's shop. And she said, yeah, I do. She says, do you have your horn? I said, well, I actually do have my French horn. It's in the trunk. I said, we were both coming from a gig the night before. So she's like, well, our second horn player had a flat tire. Can you play this rehearsal? And so I said, sure. And so I got my horn out. I sight read, Sibelius second on second horn with her. And I had this ability, again, I was never the star. I was never the top player who was going to win all the concerto competitions, but I was the player that could come in and match somebody perfectly pitch-wise, right? I could totally, I had that second horn player kind of like thing down. And that was really honed, I think, by playing a lot of chamber music my whole career as an undergraduate. I love chamber music. I think it's the best way to learn how to play with other people. But again, that was a total accident. But it was like, again, where I don't remember what the phrase is, where opportunity meets preparation or whatever.
Luck is where preparation meets opportunity or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I just happened to be like, and so that person was doing a show. She called me to sub on their Broadway show. And so it kind of got the ball rolling for me as a freelancer in New York. But again, it wasn't for me about necessarily the fact that I was the star player, but it was I was the person that could match other people. And when you're freelancing, unless you're that person that's getting called to play first a lot, which is rare, you're going to play second a lot. So you have to be able to like be that person who can be a really good colleague and collaborator, as well as being a good musician.
Totally. Yeah, and I love that you share that story because that's reality right there, folks. Is not only is it like you're not going to be getting like the lead trumpet job or the principal horn, it's going to be those inner parts, and we always talk, at least in my world, everyone always talks about how to be a good lead trumpet player in a big band or in a principal trumpet player in a symphony, but we never really talk about, okay, this is what it means to actually support your section, right? So I love that you share that story. While you're talking, I had a question that I want to pick your brain about because, in this world of injury recovery, when we, this kind of self-discovery that we go through, that we do have to, in order to, I guess, maintain good mental health, be able to separate ourselves from the outcome, right? And all that. But at the same time, if that's something within that self-discovery process, you feel that, this is still something that I want to do, right? Like win that job or whatever. Kind of in your mind, like what could be a healthy balance between being determined to reach your goals, but then also be that process oriented, not having your worth attached to that outcome?
That's a really good question. I think the balance is that what you have to focus on what you can control, and what you can control is feeling like, did I play better than I did in the last audition? Or am I making improvements when I take these auditions? Or what can I learn from that experience? And there's a really great book by Carol Dweck called Mindset, which is talking about a fixed mindset versus a growth mindset. And so having that growth mindset of like, Because if your goal is to win the job, you can't control that, right? None of us can control that. I've, my favorite, I'll tell you my favorite audition story in a moment, but I'll say that like I've made tapes where it's like, okay, I'm going to send this tape in because I paid somebody to record me, but I fucking think I sound like shit, right? Or whatever. And that tape will get accepted into another round. And there's times when I've played really, really, really wonderfully in auditions and gotten nowhere or whatever, right? So we can't control how other people hear us. We can only control what we think about what we did, right? And so that growth mindset is really key. And I'll tell you that this story is kind of like what made me have a light bulb moment about how to approach auditions. So one of my great insights into auditions came from a real life experience, right? And so this goes back to a time when I was auditioning for the New York City Opera National Company. And for whatever reason, I got bad information or I just got everything mixed up in my head. I actually went to the exact wrong place. I was physically in the wrong place for the audition. I was kind of like not close, but not terribly far away. I think I was at Carnegie Hall. And I realized, after a panic call from the company manager that I was supposed to be at the, New York State Theater. So the bottom line was I showed up to this audition and I thought to myself, well, they're going to think I'm a complete idiot, right? And so there's no way I can win this audition. And what it did was it released me of any attachment to the outcome. And I went in and I played really well. So I think part of it is detaching from the outcome, right? It's just being like, I'm going to go in and do what I can do, and just play the best I can. And another time I remember I got into the finals of an audition. I didn't win the job, but I did get into the finals of an audition. And I was warming up and I thought to my brain, my ego was like starting to go through all the stuff that the ego wants to do and say, well, you don't sound good and it doesn't feel right and it's too early and why didn't you get a later time? And it's a shame you have to play at 10 a.m. And I just stopped and I said, you know what? It's okay to play well. Like you have permission to do well. And I gave myself permission to actually show up and play well. And I thought I played way better than the other round. So I was happy. Of course, I didn't get the job, but that was another lesson of like, just saying to myself, you have permission to like actually play well.
Imagine that,
and
right?
let go of all this. Yeah. Let go of how it feels, let go of like your ego having this like dance around. So I think those are two things about auditions. And just, again, like now when I take auditions, I don't think about, oh my God, I'm spending this much money to go this. I think about like, I'm going to Chicago to visit my friends, try out some mouthpieces. And then in the middle of that, maybe I'll take this audition over here or whatever. And so it becomes kind of like a whole process for me. And again, like there's no reason for me to be taking auditions, except that I like what it does for my playing and how it focuses my preparation. And I feel like it's probably going to make me a better teacher when I do that too, because I'm really like having to kind of break down my playing and analyze it under a microscope. So
cool.
I don't know if that answers all of your questions about
No, that answered it beautifully, actually. I think just because there's nothing wrong. I don't want anybody to get from our conversation that it's wrong to have aspirations with your playing, right? It's just and that's what part of what drives us, right? But it's the outcome being the reason why you're doing it, right? Or being that's not the best way to put it, but you're attaching it to your value. I think we use that phrase a lot, but it doesn't really sink in until you have something happen that really makes you reevaluate, but not attaching yourself to the outcome. So Michael, just briefly, go ahead, please.
No, I was going to say one more thing, which is, this quote from Brene Brown, who quotes, I think it's Teddy Roosevelt talking about daring greatly. And just like, because there's times when you're in there and it's like, oh my God, I just bombed that audition. And it's so easy to beat ourselves up. And it's like actually showing up to that audition, you've taken a really huge act of courage, and you need to like congratulate yourself for even going that far, because it's going to make you a better musician. And you are going to eventually, find that spot that's right for you, whether it's in that orchestra or that jazz band or wherever it is. But it's all a process, and you can't focus on the outcome. You've got to focus on the process and just realize that like it takes a lot of courage to do what we do, and we need to celebrate that even in those moments where we just want to beat ourselves up.
Totally. Yeah, we got to celebrate the small wins, right?
Yeah.
So as we're kind of wrapping up, there's a couple questions I want to ask you before we get finished up here. But I want to give you an opportunity to kind of just go into empowering musicians and the podcast that you have and the Facebook group, and why you decided to do that. I don't know how much your injury influenced it, but either way, I just think it's such an amazing resource for musicians, no matter where they are in their progression, people my age or otherwise, like for people that have. So why did you decide to do that, and kind of what is it all about?
Yeah, so I really wanted to start having a conversation that was about what is it that we need to know broadly about the business of music or the art of music or whatever you want to call it, that doesn't involve playing our instruments, because the focus is so much about technical mastery of our skills that we sometimes what is it worth? Like, what is playing into my French horn worth in this moment or this moment over here? And so I really wanted to focus on what is everything else that you need to know that doesn't involve playing your instrument. And so I came up with this term of empowering musicians, because to me, that's like where people are really empowered. And it was really a function of years working for the American Federation of Musicians, freelancing, and just saying things like, how does this person not know that their playing is important, but being a good colleague is also important, right?
Yeah.
Or, or like I'll give you one, or like, what is a price for what my work is in this one situation, right? Or this situation over here. And so, I use this example in one of my podcast episodes where I was playing with a community band in Los Angeles when I was briefly living out there. And, it was a completely non-paid thing because it was a community band. And, somebody asked me, oh, well, there's this video games concert that Pasadena is doing next week. And I was like, oh, does it pay anything? They're like, no, it doesn't really pay anything. And I said, well, are they charging? He's like, yeah, they charge tickets and all this stuff. And I thought to myself, no, I don't want to do that, because I'm willing to play for free here because this is a community endeavor, right? But somebody else is making money over here. So I have to reevaluate that. I have to see that as a different set of kind of standards I'm going to bring to that opportunity. And having those kind of critical conversations, I just felt like in my work at the AFM, I was seeing like that people were not learning that. So I really wanted to talk about what is it that we need to know, not only about the things like mindset and playing, which I love to talk about, but also what are the extra musical skills that we need to have, and then what do we need to know, about this to succeed. So that was the impetus for creating my Facebook group, and then this Empowering Musicians podcast, which is available on audio, but also on YouTube. You can watch all the videos. And I've had some really interesting guests, from composers to orchestra managers to soloists to teachers. And so I try to keep it really broad, but again, I just really enjoy having this conversation about not only great artists, but also how did you build a career doing what you do?
Totally. And to your credit, and also kind of, I guess, to put a little connecting thing between, I guess, what we both do is just thinking about how if you apply those principles that you teach on your show and in your group, that also will keep you from burning the candle at both ends when you don't need to, right? And keeps you healthy and from all different facets. Because I remember having a conversation with one of my buddies. He just recently transferred here from a school in Texas, and just an incredible drummer. He's almost immediately when he got to Utah, he was taken. I mean, there's not really a huge scene in my area, but enough of one that you could be, if you're cutting it, that you could be working every weekend and all that stuff, even as a college student. And I just told him, it was like, you got to be really choosy about the things that you decide to take and how you market yourself and all these things, because ultimately, I've had mentors who burn the candle at both ends and they're paying the price for it now. and when they
Yeah.
didn't necessarily need to do that. And so I just think what you teach over there is just so valuable, and everyone listening now should definitely go check him out on empowering the musicians. So Michael, I love asking these last two questions. I look forward to this part of the interview probably more than any other. Not because it's the end, but just because the questions,
Yeah.
I love the answers I get. But the first question I ask is, if you had the opportunity to go back to Pittsburgh, that day of all days, right? That Murphy's Law day, or however you want to call it. And just looking back at the journey that you've had because of that experience, would you leave that experience there, or would you, if you had the power to take it away, would you do that? I mean, I don't know if I would choose on getting mugged or not, but
Yeah. That's a really fascinating question. I mean, in some ways, I would say no, I wouldn't take it away, because it shaped who I was as a musician and as a person in really profound ways, even though it was a deeply negative experience. And I don't know where my career would have gone had it not happened. But I do think that it helped me put into perspective who I was as a musician and a person at an early age, and I think that was valuable. So I'm not sure that I would change things, given how it probably shaped everything else in my life.
Yeah, it's beautiful. I mean, yeah, I didn't know what you were going to say, honestly, because the whole getting mugged thing, I don't know if I'd choose to let that happen to me again, but
Yeah.
But it's beautiful how even just the toughest of experiences can really just shape who we are if we let them, right? And that's what I hope people get from this show is that principle, because I have musicians of all different backgrounds and instrumentation on my show, but that principle, I hope, is the overarching principle is no matter what it is, that's what happens,
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I think that one thing that I would change in my training is that I feel like I would be more broad in my education. Like, I might be a really good conductor. I don't know, because I've never studied it. I never thought about it. I never thought about composing. I thought more about writing words, because I just found the idea of writing music really intimidating. So like, I think one of the things that is potentially a flaw of our undergraduate and graduate education is that if we're focused only on that one thing about performance and on an instrument, we're robbing ourselves of a lot of other opportunities of like, well, maybe I'm a great conductor, or maybe this is also a passion of mine. So I think broadening my education is something that I would have changed.
Oh, cool. Well, thank you for sharing that. And so last question that I have is, regardless of the instrument or whatever people's experiences are, if somebody were to come up to you and say, "Hey, Michael, I was listening to Trust the Process that you were on a little while ago, and I'm going through my own injury," no matter what instrument that person is going through, what would be a piece of advice that you could give me? What would be your answer to that question if somebody asked, what would be your one piece?
Yeah. I think my one piece of advice would be grateful for wherever you are and what you can do. So maybe one day you can only play one note, right? And be really grateful and have a lot of gratitude that you can put that sound into the universe and build on it. Maybe, for me, it was a mouth injury. Maybe I could have decided, well, maybe I'm going to play the cello now, right? If it was not possible for me to play. So maybe there was another outlet where I could have looked at making music or serving the world. One thing I did notice in my career was that, like, especially I feel like this is true when I practice for auditions, right? Is that, like, music is not that creative. It's much more like being an athlete. And so I discovered that I had a really creative side, and the way for me to express that was through writing, much more than music. I do think there's some creativity, especially in chamber music, and there's interpretation that you're doing, of course. It's like an interpretive art form. But, ask yourself, like, what else do I want to do? Like, what,
Sure.
I love to play the flute, but I also love blank, blank, blank. And then try to like create that perspective. But again, I think just having gratitude. I mean, I feel so lucky because again, there are people that had no injury who in my life, I know that just, got destroyed by playing, a really heavy show for 3 years or whatever, and they got dystonia. And so I feel very grateful. And I think gratitude is like the key to everything.
Beautiful. Gratitude is the key to everything. That's such a beautiful way to tie this episode up with a little bow. Thank you so much for your time today, Michael. I really, really have enjoyed our conversation. I've been looking forward to it for a while. It's been a wonderful time talking to you. How can people find you?
Yeah,
Sorry.
Absolutely. So, I was going to say it's been great being your guest, and I really appreciate this, being able to go into this subject, because not a lot of people are really covering injury, and I think it's really important that you're doing it. So congratulations. People can either find me on Facebook, my Empowering Musicians group. Also, Empowering Musicians podcast is on YouTube, Audible, and Spotify. And then email, it's just my last name, Manley, and my instrument, horn. So manleyhorn@gmail.com is a good way to find me. So those are the best methods. And, you can always just put a comment in my group or on one of my podcasts, and I'll reach out.
Awesome. Well, everybody, this was one that you need to share with everyone around you. Musicians or not, has a bunch of beautiful principles that can be applied everywhere. So thanks for listening and joining us today. And until next time, keep trusting the process. Thanks for listening today. I hope you got as much out of it as I did. To see a full bio for our guest today, see the show notes, or go to our website at trusttheprocesspodcast.com. Make sure you share this with a musician you care about who is going through injury, a music educator in your life, or anyone just trying to make it in life. If you have a suggestion for a guest or topic to cover, shoot me an email at trustprocesspodcast@gmail.com or send me a message on Facebook or Instagram. Before we go, I just want to give a heartfelt thank you and shout out to my team, Daniel Baldwin, who is my audio engineer, Kevin West, who does all music and sound effects for the show, Peyton Womack, our website developer, and my sister, Dana Lovell, who created the logo and promotional materials. We wouldn't have the show without them. So tune in next time for another episode of Trust the Process.